November 1st, 1943. Cape Torokina, Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. The first wave of Marines of the 3rd Marine Division hit the beach at Cape Torokina in the early morning of November 1st, 1943, and the Japanese defenders who opposed them at the water's edge produced casualties that the Marines who survived the landing described with the specific bluntness of men who had been through Guadalcanal and who knew the difference between a hard landing and a bad one. This was a bad one. The beach at Cape Torokina was covered by Japanese positions that had been positioned to engage exactly the kind of frontal amphibious assault that the doctrine of the era specified. The Marine casualties in the first hours of the landing were heavy enough to produce the specific command concern that occurs when the rate of attrition in the assault waves threatens to exhaust the force before it can establish itself ashore. But the landing at Cape Torokina was not designed to take Bougainville. It was designed to take a piece of Bougainville, specifically a piece large enough to build an airfield on and defend, and the specific piece that MacArthur's planners had selected at Cape Torokina was chosen not because it was the easiest to take but because it was strategically the most valuable. Bougainville was the largest island in the Solomon Chain, approximately 125 miles long and 30 to 40 miles wide, covered with jungle and mountainous terrain, and home to approximately 40,000 Japanese soldiers who had been on the island since its occupation in 1942. Those 40,000 soldiers were distributed across the island in positions that reflected the Japanese understanding that the Allies would eventually attempt to take Bougainville as part of the campaign that had begun at Guadalcanal and was working its way up the Solomon Chain toward Rabaul. The Allied plan for Bougainville was built on the same strategic logic that had driven the decision to bypass Rabaul rather than assault it directly. Taking all of Bougainville and destroying its 40,000-man garrison would require a force and a timeline that the Southwest Pacific campaign could not afford. But taking enough of Bougainville to build and operate the airfield that would bring Rabaul within range of Allied land-based fighters required only a fraction of that force and a fraction of that time. The Japanese on Bougainville did not have to be defeated. They only had to be isolated. The Marine landing at Cape Torokina, in the specific piece of Bougainville's coastline that the Japanese had assessed as the least likely landing point because its terrain was so difficult, was the instrument of that isolation. If the Marines could establish and hold a perimeter around the Cape Torokina area large enough to contain an airfield and small enough to be defended by the available force, the 40,000 Japanese soldiers elsewhere on the island would be unable to supply themselves adequately, unable to threaten the Allied advance past their position, and unable to contribute to the defense of Rabaul that was the point of their being on Bougainville in the first place. They would be trapped. Not by a perimeter they could not breach, because 40,000 soldiers could breach any perimeter that 14,000 could defend if they were willing to accept the casualties, but by the strategic reality that breaching the perimeter and fighting their way through the Allied force to reach the airfield would cost them more than the airfield was worth to prevent once it was operational. Rear Admiral Omori understood what the landing at Cape Torokina meant before the Marines were fully established ashore, and he sortied from Rabaul with a force of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers to intercept the American transports and disrupt the landing. The engagement that followed in the darkness of Empress Augusta Bay on the night of November 1st to 2nd was one of the most important naval engagements of the Solomon campaign and one of the most clearly one-sided in its outcome relative to the forces involved. The American naval force that met Omori's sortie was commanded by Rear Admiral Arleigh Burke, who would later become one of the most celebrated naval officers in American history and whose specific qualities as a surface warfare tactician were demonstrated in exactly the conditions that the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay produced, a night engagement in confined waters between forces of roughly comparable size. Burke's force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers had been trained in the night fighting tactics that the early Solomon Islands campaign had taught through repeated painful experience. The Japanese had been better at night surface combat than the Americans in 1942, a fact that the Battle of Savo Island and subsequent engagements had demonstrated at significant cost in American ships and lives. By November 1943, the Americans had learned. The engagement at Empress Augusta Bay lasted approximately 2 hours and produced the result that Burke's training and his tactical skill had prepared for. Omori's force, intended to destroy the American transports at anchor and disrupt the Bougainville landing, was instead engaged by Burke's cruisers and destroyers and forced to withdraw, having accomplished none of its objectives and having lost 1 light cruiser and 1 destroyer sunk with additional damage to other vessels. The Marines on the beach at Cape Torokina did not know that a naval battle was being fought in the bay beyond them as they consolidated their positions against the Japanese defenders, but the outcome of that naval battle determined whether the strategic concept behind the Bougainville landing would have the time it needed to become reality. Omori withdrew. The transports remained. The Marines consolidated. The construction of the airfield at Cape Torokina began almost immediately, with Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, working in conditions that the Bougainville jungle produced with its characteristic indifference to construction timelines. The Seabees had developed by late 1943 the specific combination of equipment, organizational efficiency, and institutional experience that made them capable of producing military construction on timelines that no civilian construction organization could have matched. The airfield at Cape Torokina was operational by December 1943, approximately 6 weeks after the landing. The first aircraft that took off from it could reach Rabaul. The Japanese on Bougainville, who had been positioned to defend the island against the Allied advance that they had correctly anticipated, found themselves instead in the situation that MacArthur's planners had designed, with 14,000 Allied soldiers in a defensible perimeter that the Japanese would have to assault through difficult terrain and at significant cost, with air cover from the Cape Torokina airfield that could prevent effective resupply and reinforcement, and with Rabaul, the strategic base whose defense was the reason for their presence on Bougainville, now under attack from the airfield that their 40,000 soldiers had not been able to prevent. The Japanese counterattack on the Empress Augusta Bay perimeter came in March 1944, when General Hyakutake assembled the forces available to him on Bougainville for the assault that was his only remaining option if the perimeter was to be eliminated before the airfield it contained became fully operational. The attack that Hyakutake launched against the American perimeter on March 8, 1944 was the largest Japanese ground offensive in the Solomon Islands and was conducted with the determination of soldiers who understood that it was their last opportunity to change the strategic situation on Bougainville. It failed. The American defensive positions that the Marines and the Army's American Division had built into the terrain around the perimeter absorbed the Japanese assault with the specific effectiveness that prepared defensive positions with adequate artillery support produce against infantry assault, and the casualties that Hyakutake's force sustained in the 3-week battle that followed were casualties that the garrison on Bougainville could not replace. The 40,000 Japanese soldiers on Bougainville, who had been the central element of Japanese defensive planning for the Solomon Islands, spent the remainder of the war on an island they could not leave, supplied by submarines that could not provide the volume they needed, conducting operations against an Allied perimeter they could not breach, and watching the airfield at Cape Torokina support the campaign that was reducing Rabaul to irrelevance. Bougainville was declared secure in January 1945, though the Japanese soldiers who remained on the island did not surrender until Japan's overall capitulation in August 1945. What the Bougainville campaign accomplished was exactly what MacArthur's planners had specified it should accomplish. 40,000 Japanese soldiers were made strategically irrelevant by 14,000 Allied soldiers who took a small piece of the island instead of all of it, built an airfield, held the perimeter, and left the Japanese garrison to consume its own resources while the war moved past it. It was the operational logic of cartwheel applied at the island level, and it worked with the specific efficiency that the logic of bypass strategy produces when the strategic terrain permits it and the tactical execution is sound. The Marines who landed at Cape Torokina on November 1, 1943, in the surf that the Japanese defenders had seeded with fire from positions they had spent months preparing, were the tactical instrument of a strategic concept that they did not need to understand in order to execute. They needed to take the beach and hold it long enough for the concept to develop. They took it. They held it. That was enough.